If you've seen the movie, forget about it. The comics are the real deal. Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally, like today. Today I'm talking about Hellboy, probably my favorite comic of all time. Hellboy is amazing. As usual though, let's start with what it's got. A protagonist who was literally summoned from hell, pulpy action, stunning original artwork, snappy one-liners, detective stories, excellent writing, ghosts, monsters, Rasputin, robot Nazis, world-ending elder gods, lots of folklore references, lots of Nazi punching, and one really huge pistol. So there have been some movies based on Hellboy. 3 of them. They're not bad. They're fun, action-y, adventure-y, supernaturally, sort of superhero-y romps. They have some extremely fun action scenes and some really nice monster work, but they're not nearly as good as the comics. Mike Mignola wrote and created Hellboy. He actually said of the movies, he said the first 2 anyway are Guillermo del Toro's own thing. They're a thing that is called Hellboy, but he doesn't really see them as that connected to the comics. The comics have also spawned what fans call the Mignolaverse. Mike Mignola is the creator. The Mignolaverse is a whole world that the Hellboy comics take place in, but he's also gone on to create many other comics like BPRD, like Lobster Johnson. I'm forgetting the other ones right now, but there are like 6 or 7 different titles that all take place in the same kind of world. And he's opened that world up to other artists as well. After he did the primary Hellboy story, a bunch of other artists have done stories in the Hellboy universe for Hellboy and other characters. It's also spawned, like I said, 3 movies, a board game, and an animated series. So it's kind of a pop culture thing. Most people I know will have heard of Hellboy, but most people I know will have not read Hellboy. So, how to read Hellboy? I started reading the individual comic issues back when they came out in the 90s, the very, very first ones. And since then, the primary story of Hellboy has been completely told. And then there are lots of little side quest kind of stories that branch off different places throughout Hellboy's timeline. The way I'm reading it again is through these lovely books. They're called the Hellboy Library Editions. They are linen bound and debossed with foil and with a nice sketch from Mike Mignola on the front and classic Mike Mignola skull. He draws lots of skulls. There are 6 of these. They are really heavy. They're not cheap. They're not crazy expensive, but they're not super affordable. The really nice thing about these is that they're so big, which means you actually get the artwork from Hellboy bigger than it was in the original comic, like by about 20% bigger, which is why I've got them. If you've never read Hellboy and you're not willing to commit, understandably, to 6 of these expensive books, you can actually get most of the story. It only doesn't include some of the side stories, which is the nice thing about the library editions. They do include lots of, not all, but lots of the side stories. You can get an omnibus edition, which is, I think, 3 different omnibus books in paperback in a box set. That would be the way to get it. There are, beyond that though, there are millions, it seems like, of comics that are related. They're part of the Mignola universe, or the Mignolaverse. As far as the story goes, I won't spoil it, but right in the beginning, most of this is pretty clear. Rasputin, the historical character Rasputin, he exists in the Mignolaverse, but he is an undying sorcerer. And at the beginning of the story, he summons a demon from hell to end the world, to bring back the elder gods and help end the world. The US Army comes in and stops him. And some paranormal researchers, Dr. Broom, I believe his name is the primary one. He is there with the US Army. They stop the Nazis because 50s pulp comics, you always stop the Nazis. And they, or Dr. Broom specifically, adopts this baby demon. It's a little child demon with a huge stone hand on its right arm, and raises him to be human. So as you might imagine, the whole story, the whole theme of Hellboy is being an outsider. He's a monster. He's bright red. He has horns. He has this huge stone hand. He has a tail. He's a demon. So being an outsider, being a monster, being something that probably everyone's afraid of, and trying your best to be a good person and to be a human anyway. That's essentially the main theme of the whole story. Hellboy is then raised by the professor, and they found the BPRD, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. And then all sorts of adventures ensue. There are other characters who also join the BPRD. At some point, they discover a fish man who they name Abe Sapien, and he becomes one of Hellboy's best friends. There's a sort of love story with a woman who can, Liz, I believe her name is, who can set her hands on fire and control fire and has fire powers. And as the story progresses, it becomes more and more apparent that all of the stuff that Rasputin said originally when he summoned him is true. Hellboy is the key to the apocalypse, and it's him fighting against this, trying not to end the world, trying to remain a good human, even though deep in his nature, he is actually a demon and he is actually from hell. The main thing that got me into Hellboy originally, other than the fact that the story is actually very, very cool, very, very interesting, quite well written, is the artwork. The artwork is amazing to me. Nowadays, maybe it's less surprising, but in the 90s when it started, it seemed like all of the comic book artists were falling all over themselves to add more and more detail. There were thousands of little lines in the illustrations that were getting very, very exact and very, very detailed and intricate and over the top. And Hellboy came on the scene, and usually most panels in Hellboy have two main colors, black and red, because Hellboy's red, and then a background color, brown, green, blue, whatever. And the majority of the frames, so many of the famous frames from the Hellboy comics, are at least 50%, if not more, flat black. No shading, nothing. And what that does, I find, is two really interesting things artistically. One, it lets your imagination fill in a lot of the details, and usually these really, really black, heavily black, flat black frames, they come at times when something scary is going on. There is a horror element to Hellboy because he's researching all of these monsters and ghosts and paranormal things going on. So very often there'll be very, very dark scenes with very little detail, which allows your imagination to fill in the horror. You get just enough detail to know what's going on, and then the scary things are often hidden in the black part of the panel, or only very lightly suggested by a pair of eyes or a little bit of light falling on a claw or something like that. And it gives your mind a whole lot of space to imagine what's going on in the picture. And then for the big action scenes, usually more color comes in and it becomes more explicit. And it's an amazing technique that works extremely well for the material. It gives you a feeling of a very dark, sort of gothic world where there's almost always shadow. It's very rarely daytime. There's one particular short story called Pancakes, where the professor takes the young Hellboy out for pancakes. Hellboy loves pancakes. And that one is actually quite brightly lit because there isn't much horror going on in that. But most of the stories, Hellboy is fighting some monster, investigating some horrible crime, or chasing a ghost or something. And there is just amazing use of color and amazing use of non-color, black, throughout the frames. Also, the timing of the frames, I'll put up an example here. The timing of the frames is quite amazing. This is where Hellboy is waiting to be told something by a corpse, and he's told to be in a certain place at a certain time. And you can see as the frames go around, there's nothing there. He's waiting, he looks at his watch, and then there is something there. So there's a lot of these timing effects used in frame by frame progress through a page. It's just so good. I love it so much. I would recommend to everyone to read Hellboy, even if you're not that into comics. If you're into manga at all, it's a very different kind of comic, obviously, than manga. Manga has all of the Japanese comic tropes and traditions with the over-the-top facial expressions and the lines all over the place to indicate action and excitement and movement and that kind of thing. Hellboy doesn't have any of that. But if you've already started with comics and you've enjoyed them, I would strongly recommend picking up at least the first omnibus of Hellboy and see what you think. I actually want to buy some original prints sometime soon, if I can afford them, signed by Mignola. I love his work that much. He's got so many beautiful, beautiful drawings and inkings, and color selection and everything is so spot on. It's amazing. So yes, you should read Hellboy. No question about it. So as always, I hope you're well. Keep reading awesome comics, and I will see you next time.